I just cannot give you 100% of an answer right now.
You don't say that right now.
I believe now that you have something inside of you that's manipulative. It needs to stop. I'm not having the conversation anymore.
Don't talk to me with that attitude like that.
Edward has spent weeks begging Marissa to tell him whether she actually wants to marry him, but this morning he is not begging, he is not arguing, and he is definitely not asking for reassurance, because sitting on his phone is something Marissa never expected to see. A confirmed flight back to the Dominican Republic that leaves only 3 days before their wedding. At first, she thinks he is trying to scare her, but then she looks closer and realizes this is not a flight search, this is not a screenshot of a possible ticket, and this is not Edward making another emotional threat in the middle of an argument, because the reservation has already been paid for. The strangest part, though, is not that Edward bought the ticket, because what really changes everything is when Marissa notices the date it was purchased, and suddenly she has to wonder whether Edward has been quietly planning his exit while telling her they still had time to save their relationship. The morning starts with the kind of silence that immediately tells you something happened before the cameras ever caught up with them, because Edward is sitting at the table with coffee in front of him. Marissa is moving around the kitchen like she is trying to act normal, and neither of them seems interested in being the first person to reopen the argument from the night before. Normally, Edward is the one who cannot sit in uncomfortable silence for very long, because when something is bothering him, he wants to talk, explain, question, and keep pushing until he feels like somebody has actually heard him. This time, though, he barely looks at Marissa, and that change matters because nothing makes a relationship feel more unstable than when the person who is fighting hardest suddenly becomes the quiet one. Marissa eventually asks whether he slept okay, and Edward gives her the kind of answer that technically responds to the question without actually telling her anything useful. He says he slept enough, takes another sip of coffee, and goes back to looking at his phone, which immediately starts bothering Marissa because she can tell his attention is somewhere else. She asks whether he is waiting for a call, and Edward says no, he is just checking something, but he does not explain what that something is. Now, considering how much of their recent conflict has been about trust, phones, jealousy, and whether they are being completely honest with each other, you would think Edward might understand that staring at a screen and refusing to explain himself is probably not the best way to start the morning, but Edward seems almost completely unconcerned with how suspicious it looks. Marissa tries another approach and brings up the agreement they made after their last major argument, because instead of ending everything immediately, they had talked about giving themselves a little more time and working on the problems that had been wearing them down. Marissa reminds him that she wants them to focus on communication, his jealousy, her lack of affection, and especially Edward becoming more independent instead of building his entire life around her. Edward listens without interrupting, and for about 10 seconds it almost looks like the conversation might actually stay calm, but then he says something that completely changes the mood when he tells her, "You wanted more time, and I'm giving you more time, but I also have to protect myself." That phrase catches Marissa immediately because protect myself can mean a lot of things when a wedding is already hanging by a thread, and judging by her expression, she knows Edward is not talking about opening a separate checking account or spending an afternoon by himself. She asks what exactly he means, but Edward says he does not want another argument before they have even finished breakfast. That response only makes her push harder, because if Edward is going to sit across from her and announce that he is protecting himself from something, she wants to know what he thinks he needs protection from. Edward finally looks up from the phone and tells her that every serious conversation between them ends with Marissa saying she does not know whether she wants to marry him, which means he has to start thinking about what happens to him if her final answer is no. And this is where the entire balance of their relationship begins to shift, because for weeks Marissa has had the luxury of being the uncertain person while Edward has been the one waiting for a decision. She can ask for time, she can question whether love is enough, she can analyze Edward's behavior, and she can decide whether he is becoming the kind of partner she needs, while Edward basically remains in place hoping she eventually chooses him. The problem is that Edward now seems to have realized that waiting is also a decision, and even if Marissa is not ready to choose him, he does not necessarily have to keep sitting there indefinitely while she decides what his future looks like. Marissa asks whether Edward is saying he wants to leave, and he immediately tells her that is not what he said. He explains that he wants the relationship to work, but wanting something and being prepared for reality are two different things, especially when he has spent several weeks hearing the woman he planned to marry say she is no longer sure. Marissa tells him she has never said she does not love him, but Edward points out that love is not the question he keeps asking, because the question is whether she intends to marry him. According to Edward, every time he asks that directly, Marissa gives him another explanation about why she needs more time instead of giving him the answer he actually needs. Then Edward finally says it, almost casually at first, and somehow that makes the moment feel even heavier, because he tells Marissa he has been looking at flights back to the Dominican Republic. Marissa gives a nervous little laugh as if she is waiting for him to admit he is exaggerating, but Edward does not smile back. She asks whether he means he searched for flights after their argument, and Edward says he has been checking different options because if the wedding does not happen, he needs to know what he is doing next. Marissa immediately hears that as a threat, and she asks why Edward would be planning to leave while they are supposed to be working on their relationship. Edward tells her those two things are not mutually exclusive, because he can hope they fix the relationship while also refusing to leave himself completely unprepared if they do not. Now, I can understand why Marissa does not like hearing that, because nobody wants to sit down with the person they are supposed to marry and discover that person has already researched an escape route. But there is also something slightly strange about Marissa being shocked that Edward would think about leaving when she has repeatedly told him that marriage is not guaranteed. If you tell somebody for weeks that you are not sure whether they still have a place in your future, eventually that person is going to start thinking about a future without you, and Edward appears to have reached exactly that point. The bigger question is whether he is genuinely preparing himself emotionally, or whether he knows mentioning the flight will force Marissa to make a decision faster than she wants to. Marissa asks the obvious question, and you can see Edward knows this is the part he has been avoiding, because she looks directly at him and says, "Did you actually buy one?" Edward pauses long enough that he does not really need to answer, because Marissa's face changes almost immediately. She asks again, this time more slowly, and Edward tells her he does have a reservation. Marissa leans back in her chair and looks genuinely stunned, because searching flights is one thing, but spending money on a ticket makes this a real plan. She asks to see it, and Edward initially says there is no reason for her to go through his phone, which is probably the worst possible choice of words considering their recent history. Marissa immediately reminds him that he had plenty to say about honesty when he was worried about her phone calls, so if he has bought a ticket that could completely change their wedding, she believes she has every right to know when he is leaving. Edward eventually unlocks his phone and opens the reservation. Marissa looks at the destination first, and there it is, Santo Domingo. Then she looks at the departure date, and suddenly this is no longer just a backup plan sitting somewhere in the distant future, because Edward's flight leaves 3 days before their scheduled wedding. Marissa looks at him like she cannot understand how he could possibly consider that coincidence, and Edward tells her the date was chosen because it was one of the cheaper options available. That explanation does absolutely nothing to calm her down, because from Marissa's perspective, Edward has purchased a ticket that effectively creates his own deadline. If the relationship is still uncertain by that day, he gets on the plane, and if Marissa wants him to stay, she suddenly has a very limited amount of time to convince him. She asks whether the ticket is refundable, and Edward says there is a cancellation period, but that window is closing soon. Marissa wants to know how soon, and Edward tells her he has about 24 hours left to cancel without losing most of the money. Now we suddenly have a countdown sitting on top of an already stressful relationship, because the wedding has always come with pressure, but this ticket creates a much more immediate decision. Marissa does not have weeks to think about how she feels about Edward leaving anymore, because within 1 day, he is to decide whether he is keeping his route home open or committing himself completely to staying. Marissa tells him that this feels manipulative, and Edward immediately pushes back because, according to him, he never said she had to do anything. He says he did not buy the ticket to force her to marry him. He bought it because he cannot wake up every day wondering whether this will be the morning Marissa finally tells him the relationship is over. He tells her that he left his home, his routines, his friends, and the people he could rely on because he believed they were building something together, but since arriving, he feels like almost every conversation has become another evaluation of whether he deserves to remain in her life. Then Edward says something that finally cuts through the argument, because instead of raising his voice, he tells Marissa, "I cannot keep waking up every morning wondering if today is the day you decide I'm not good enough for you." Marissa becomes emotional, but not in the way Edward seems to expect. She tells him he is taking her concerns and turning them into rejection, when what she has actually been trying to say is that she takes marriage seriously enough not to pretend everything is fine when it clearly is not. She reminds him that his jealousy has created problems, that his behavior around her ex made her uncomfortable, and that there have been moments when she felt like Edward was testing her instead of trusting her. From Marissa's perspective, asking for time is not cruelty, because walking into a marriage while these issues remain unresolved would be worse for both of them. Edward actually agrees with part of that, and this is important because the scene works much better if nobody is completely right. He admits that trying to catch Marissa in a contradiction about her ex was a bad decision, and he says he understands why it damaged trust. What he does not accept is the idea that every mistake he makes should automatically send the wedding back into question while Marissa's own behavior somehow remains separate from the conversation. He says she has become colder, less affectionate, and more critical since he arrived, yet whenever he reacts badly to feeling rejected, the reaction becomes the only thing anybody talks about. Marissa tells him that emotional pressure is exactly what she is afraid of, and then she points at his phone and says the ticket proves her point. She asks how she is supposed to calmly work through their problems when Edward can now say, whether directly or indirectly, that he is a plane waiting if she does not give him what he wants. Edward says he has never told her to stop him, which is already a pretty sharp response, but then he makes it even worse when he adds, "Maybe you shouldn't." That line completely changes Marissa's expression, because I do not think she was expecting Edward to go that far. Up until this point, she may have believed the ticket was really an elaborate way of asking her to reassure him, because Edward has always seemed desperate for confirmation that she still loves him and wants the relationship. Instead, he is suddenly telling her that she does not have to convince him to stay, and that is a very different Edward from the man who was previously pushing her for answers. Whether this is confidence, frustration, or Edward emotionally shutting down is still unclear, but Marissa can definitely feel the difference. She asks whether he even wants to marry her anymore, and Edward says he would not still be sitting there if he did not care, but that is not the same as saying yes. Marissa notices the difference immediately and points out that Edward has spent weeks criticizing her for being uncertain, yet now he is giving her the exact same kind of answer. Edward tells her the difference is that his uncertainty came after repeatedly being told she was not sure about him. Marissa says that does not make his uncertainty more valid than hers, and for the first time in this conversation, Edward does not have a quick response. Then, because apparently this relationship cannot discuss one problem without accidentally opening 3 older ones, the issue of Marissa's ex comes back into the room. Edward says part of the reason he started considering what life would look like back home was because he no longer feels secure in the relationship, especially after learning Marissa was still communicating with someone from her past. Marissa becomes defensive immediately and tells him they have already discussed this, because being in contact with an ex does not automatically mean she wants that relationship back. Edward says he understands that, but the problem for him is that Marissa asks for complete trust while simultaneously refusing to give him certainty about their marriage. In Edward's mind, those two things are almost impossible to separate. Marissa tells him his jealousy is creating connections that do not exist, because her doubts about the wedding are based on what has happened between the two of them, not on some secret desire to reconnect with somebody else. Edward asks why she kept the communication so quiet if it was completely harmless, and Marissa reminds him that this is exactly the kind of interrogation that makes her wonder whether marriage would make his insecurity worse rather than better. Once again, they are trapped in the same cycle where Edward's fear makes him question Marissa. Marissa reacts to being questioned by pulling away, and Edward then treats her distance as evidence that his fear was justified. The frustrating part is that both of them can identify the other person's role in that cycle much more easily than they can see their own. Edward believes Marissa's uncertainty created his insecurity, while Marissa believes Edward's insecurity created her uncertainty, and neither one of them seems prepared to admit that at this point those problems are feeding each other. The ticket simply takes an emotional problem that has been building for weeks and turns it into something physical that Marissa can see sitting right there on Edward's phone. Then Marissa asks the question that Edward clearly hoped she would not ask because she wants to know exactly when he bought the ticket. Edward says it was recently. Marissa does not accept that answer and asks what recently means. Edward tells her it was after things started getting worse between them, but Marissa takes the phone again and checks the confirmation details herself. She scrolls for a moment, looks at the purchase date, and then looks back at Edward with a completely different expression. The reservation was not made that morning. It was not purchased after their latest fight. Edward bought the ticket around the same time they were agreeing to give the relationship another chance. Now that is the detail that gives Marissa a legitimate reason to feel blindsided, because Edward has been presenting himself as the person who wants them to stay committed to working things out, while privately making a financial decision based on the possibility that they fail. Marissa asks why he did not tell her when they were discussing their 2-week plan, and Edward says because the ticket was never supposed to become part of their relationship unless he needed it. He describes it as insurance, not a decision, but Marissa tells him that secretly preparing to leave while asking her to rebuild trust is exactly the kind of contradiction he would never accept from her. Edward says the ticket does not mean he planned to leave. It means he wanted the option to leave without being trapped at the last minute. He explains that if Marissa suddenly decides there will be no wedding, he does not want to spend the next several days panicking over where he will go or how much a last-minute ticket will cost. That explanation actually makes sense on a practical level, but emotionally it still leaves Marissa with a difficult question, because if Edward truly believed they were going to fix things, why was buying his way home important enough to do in secret? Marissa asks him directly whether part of him had already given up when he bought it. Edward takes several seconds before answering and says he does not think he had given up, but he had stopped believing love alone was going to solve everything. That sounds suspiciously similar to something Marissa has been trying to tell him for weeks, and she points that out immediately. She says Edward used to get frustrated whenever she said love was not enough, yet now he has apparently reached the same conclusion and purchased an airline ticket because of it. Edward says there is a difference between questioning the relationship and preparing for what happens if the relationship ends. Marissa tells him there really is not much difference when the preparation involves leaving before the wedding. Edward responds that there would be no reason for the ticket to matter if Marissa knew she wanted to marry him, and that comment sets her off again because now, whether Edward intends it or not, the conversation sounds like pressure. She asks him whether this whole thing is designed to force an answer out of her. Edward insists it is not, but Marissa says the effect is the same regardless of his intention. Yesterday, she believed she had time to think, talk, and see whether their relationship improved, while today she learns Edward has a ticket that expires as an option in 24 hours and leaves 3 days before the wedding. She tells him that he cannot create that kind of deadline and then act like it has nothing to do with her. Edward responds that Marissa created the first deadline when she refused to tell him whether the wedding was still happening, and now we are back to the same central issue again. Who is actually putting pressure on whom? This is where I think viewers would split completely because there is a very reasonable argument on both sides. Edward should not have to live in permanent uncertainty while Marissa decides whether he is marriage material, especially when his entire future in the United States is connected to the relationship they came there to build. At the same time, buying a secret ticket 3 days before the wedding and revealing it while your partner is still asking for time creates pressure whether you call it an ultimatum or not. Edward can say Marissa does not have to stop him, but when somebody you love tells you they may be gone in a few days, that information changes every decision you make after hearing it. Marissa eventually asks the question that strips away all the arguing and gets right to the emotional center of the situation. She says, "If I told you right now that I wanted to marry you, would you cancel the ticket?" You can tell Edward was prepared to defend why he bought it, but he was not prepared for that exact question. He looks down at the phone and tells her he would have to think about it. Marissa almost laughs again, except this time there is nothing nervous or amused about it. She tells him that answer is unbelievable after everything he has put her through over the words, "I don't know." She says Edward wanted certainty from her, demanded a clear yes or no, stormed away when she could not give him one, and now that she is finally asking him a direct question about whether he wants to stay, he suddenly needs time to think. Edward does not deny the contradiction. Instead, he says the difference is trust. According to Edward, even if Marissa suddenly says yes today, he does not know whether she is saying it because she genuinely feels ready for marriage or because seeing the plane ticket scared her. That is actually a much bigger problem than the reservation itself, because now even the answer Edward has spent weeks asking for may no longer be enough. If Marissa says no, Edward feels rejected, but if she suddenly says yes, he may question whether fear of losing him changed her answer. Marissa tells him that is completely unfair because he cannot spend weeks asking her to choose him and then distrust her choice the moment she finally does. Edward says he agrees, but that is exactly why they should not rush into a decision while both of them are emotional. That is probably the calmest thing either of them says all morning, yet it also leaves them with almost nowhere to go because the cancellation window on the ticket is still closing. The conversation finally slows down, and Marissa looks toward the hallway where Edward's suitcase is sitting. She asks whether he has packed anything yet. Edward says no. That is a small detail, but it says a lot, because somebody who has completely decided to leave usually starts preparing to go. Edward has paid for the flight, checked the dates, and created a backup plan, but his suitcase is still where it was before. He has made leaving possible without fully committing to leaving, which suggests that somewhere underneath all this frustration, he may still be hoping Marissa gives him a reason to stay. Marissa notices the same thing and asks why he has not packed if he is so serious. Edward says because he does not want to go home. For the first time all morning, Marissa stops arguing. Edward explains that going back would not feel like winning because he came to the United States believing he was starting a marriage, not testing whether he could survive 90 days of doubt. He says he does not want to return to his family and explain that the relationship collapsed, and he does not want to look back 6 months later wondering whether they quit when they could have fixed things. What he also refuses to do, though, is stay in a relationship where he constantly feels as if he has to prove why he deserves affection, trust, or commitment. Marissa says she never wanted him to feel that way, and Edward tells her intention does not erase impact, which is basically the same argument Marissa made about the plane ticket 5 minutes earlier. That realization seems to hit both of them, because they have spent so much time accusing each other of the same behaviors while describing them in completely different ways. Marissa says she wanted Edward to become more independent because she felt overwhelmed by being his entire support system, but she never wanted independence to mean he starts making major decisions about their future without including her. Edward says that is part of the problem because Marissa seems comfortable with his independence only when it fits inside boundaries she controls. She wants him to have his own life, make friends, and depend on her less, but the moment he independently creates a plan that she does not like, suddenly independence feels threatening. Now, that is probably the sharpest point Edward makes in the whole conversation, because Marissa did ask him to build a life that did not completely revolve around her, and buying a plane ticket is certainly an extreme interpretation of that request, but it exposes a real tension in what she has been asking for. She wants Edward to become secure enough not to need constant reassurance, but a secure person may eventually decide they are unwilling to remain somewhere they feel unwanted. Marissa does not answer immediately, and instead she asks what Edward wants her to do during the next 24 hours. He tells her he does not want anything from her. She says that cannot be true because tomorrow he has to make a decision. Edward says yes, but it is his decision. Marissa asks whether her feelings matter. Edward tells her of course they matter, but he does not want her to say she is ready for marriage simply because she is afraid he might leave. He says if her answer was no yesterday, then a plane ticket should not magically turn it into yes today. Marissa insists her answer was never a simple no, but Edward reminds her that when he pushed for a decision, she told him she could not promise him marriage. Again, they end up arguing over language because emotionally they're describing the same fear from opposite sides. Marissa is afraid of marrying the wrong version of Edward, while Edward is afraid of waiting for a version of Marissa who may never become certain about him. Eventually, Marissa walks away from the table, not dramatically, but because she clearly needs a minute before the conversation turns ugly again. Edward stays seated and looks at his phone, and the reservation is still sitting on the screen like a timer neither one of them can ignore. A little later, Marissa comes back and says she has one final question, but this time, she does not sound angry. She asks Edward whether he still sees her as his wife. Edward looks at her and says he still sees the life they talked about, but he is no longer sure the two people sitting in that kitchen can actually build it. That answer hurts Marissa more than anything else he has said, because Edward is not threatening her, accusing her, or demanding something. He is simply admitting that his belief in them has changed, and sometimes that is much harder to fight than anger. Anger at least means somebody is still emotionally engaged enough to battle over the relationship, while disappointment can be the point where a person starts imagining life on the other side. Marissa tells Edward she needs him to understand that her uncertainty was never about believing he was beneath her or not good enough. She says marriage scares her because she knows how much can go wrong when people ignore problems and assume love will carry them through everything. Edward says he understands that better now than he did before, but he also needs Marissa to understand that constantly asking somebody to wait while you decide whether they are worth the risk eventually changes how that person sees you. Then Marissa asks the question that finally brings everything back to the ticket. She says, "If I tell you right now that I want this marriage, are you staying?" Edward does not answer immediately, and unlike earlier in the relationship, Marissa does not interrupt the silence. He looks at her, then looks back toward the phone, and eventually says, "I don't know if I believe you anymore." That is the moment the entire problem changes. For weeks, the biggest question has been whether Marissa can become certain enough to marry Edward, but now certainty may no longer belong to her alone. Edward has spent so much time waiting for Marissa to decide that he has slowly started making decisions without her, and whether anybody likes the way he handled it or not, that plane ticket represents something much bigger than a flight home. It represents the first time Marissa can actually picture Edward choosing a future that does not include her. She wanted him to become independent. She wanted him to stop relying on her for every emotional answer, and she wanted him to prove that he could build a life instead of simply waiting for her to make him feel secure. The problem is that independence does not always produce the outcome you expect, because Edward's first major decision without Marissa may end up being the decision that takes him right out of the relationship. There are still 24 hours before the cancellation window closes, and Edward has not packed his suitcase, which means I do not believe he has completely made up his mind. At the same time, Marissa cannot simply say yes now and pretend everything that brought them here has disappeared, because a marriage built from fear of somebody leaving is not going to fix jealousy, resentment, distrust, or the way these two communicate when they feel threatened. What makes this situation so messy is that Edward may actually be doing two things at the same time without fully realizing it. He may genuinely be protecting himself from getting stranded emotionally and financially if the wedding collapses, while also knowing that showing Marissa the ticket forces her to confront something she has been able to avoid until now. She has spent weeks asking herself whether she can live with Edward, but suddenly she has to ask a much scarier question. What happens if Edward decides he can live without her? And Marissa may also be dealing with two different emotions at once, because she can be legitimately angry that Edward kept this decision from her while also being terrified that he might actually use the ticket. Her fear does not automatically mean she is ready for marriage, just as Edward buying the flight does not automatically mean he wants to leave. What it does mean is that both of them have finally reached the point where words are no longer enough, because every choice they make from here creates a real consequence. If Edward cancels the ticket, he is putting himself back into the uncertainty he says he can no longer tolerate. If he keeps it, Marissa may see that as proof he is already emotionally left. If Marissa says yes to the wedding today, Edward may question whether she means it. If she asks for more time, she risks watching him get on that plane. There really is no comfortable option left. And that is exactly why the next 24 hours could decide more than the wedding, because for the first time Edward is not standing in front of Marissa demanding that she choose him. He is quietly asking himself whether he should still choose her. The ticket is paid for. The departure date is 3 days before the ceremony, and the clock on Edward's cancellation window is already running. Marissa finally has the certainty she kept saying she needed, but it is not the kind of certainty she expected, because she now knows Edward is capable of leaving. The only thing she still does not know is whether he actually will. This story is fictional and created for entertainment.